In celebration of Porsche's 75th anniversary, Porsche Club of America looks back on one of the great stories of motorsport, how Porsche went from winning its class at its debut race at the 1951 24 Hours of Le Mans to winning Le Mans overall in 1970. This is how Porsche went from giant killer to giant. First, we speak with Rod Emory of Emory Motorsports, who shares the story of the 356 SL and Porsche's first win.
I grew up the son of a parts guy. I didn't really come to know these cars as one big piece. I came to know these cars from every nut and bolt. I've been racing Porsche since I was 16 years old and restoring them. We take the Porsche 356, which is really my life's work, and kind of finish what Porsche started. You know, they stopped making the car in 1965, and I just saw that there was always so much more potential in that little car. And now we take it and update it to a little bit more today's spec, and give it more performance and handling. Adjust the styling a little bit, but really try to keep it pure to what Porsche's vision was, a real true sports car. So my life's work is really around the 356, and it's every aspect of it. For me, the 356 SL was an amazing project because it gave me an opportunity to dig deep in the history of Porsche and to be able to really do the research and uncover some of the mysteries, the things that were lost in history that weren't quite documented. I took on, kind of the mindset that I needed to try to transport myself back in time and kind of see what those engineers and those car builders were doing when they built those cars originally. There wasn't a full set of blueprints. There wasn't a bunch of information that was going to give me the knowledge that I needed. And so I spent 5 or 6 years 3D scanning cars, like Miles Collier's car, Jeff Swartz's car, Jerry Seinfeld's car, Dave Seeland's car, kind of compiling all that information together so that I had enough knowledge to be able to restore it, not over-restore it like you see some of these cars today, but to restore it exactly how it started the race in 1951. So the 356 SLs were the super light race cars, but they really started as one of the production cars or small-scale production. When Porsche built their first 50 road-going cars, they were aluminum bodies, and then when they had these leftover bodies, they converted them to race cars. So basically took a street car, put the development in, developed a race car, and went racing. Well, if you look at what many of us in the industry do today, whether it's myself or Roof or Singer or Gunther Works or whoever else that's taking these cars and just, moving them forward a little bit. We're basically taking a street car and just giving it a little more performance, maybe adjusting the styling, doing a few things to personalize them, and then making it our own. And, that's what Porsche did with these 356 SLs. So Porsche had been designing and building cars for other car companies and Volkswagen in particular previous to the war. But when it was time to build their own car, they took everything that they loved and brought it into the little 356. Porsche started building the car in 1948 in a sawmill in Gmünd, Austria. They built 50 road-going cars, and then there were some leftover chassis that were built in period in Gmünd, Austria. But then in 1950, when Porsche moved back to Germany, they had these cars and trying to figure out what to do with them. And a lot of the components on the early Gmünd aluminum-bodied cars were VW chassis components. But everything that they put into the Porsche 356 was a little bit better. So the brakes were better, the transmission was better, the engine was a dual-port engine instead of single-port. And it was a very unique look that created the silhouette of the Porsche that we all enjoy today, carrying all the way through to the 992 and beyond. When they were invited to race the 24 Hours of Le Mans in 1951, they had to evaluate whether they were going to use the steel-bodied cars that they just had ordered from Reuter, or to utilize a few of the leftover aluminum-bodied chassis. Well, they chose to use the aluminum ones for a number of reasons. It's lightweight, and they had them. And back then the car company was so small that resources were limited, and sometimes it's use what you've got and then develop it. So Porsche took 4 of these bodies that were left over, They took 2 of them and sent them to Reuter, which was their coach builder, and 2 to another small coach builder in Stuttgart, Dannenhauer. And they wanted to do some styling and aerodynamic studies on the cars because they knew if they were going to go to Le Mans, they weren't going to win on horsepower. So they knew that in order to compete on that stage with all these big giants and all these cars that are just amazing, they needed to really do their homework. They took the cars and massaged the roof lines on the cars, subtle little aerodynamic things to really see during testing what created more top speed and, how they could get down the Mulsanne straight, with 45 horsepower and do it, efficiently. They added fender skirts or wheel spats to, keep that air from pocketing in behind the wheels. In the end, they took these 4 cars, put lots of miles on them, developed all the stuff. It was chassis number 54, 55, 56, and then the last one of these aluminum 163. They figured out which cars were going to work the best. They'd entered chassis number 54 and 63 at Le Mans, and a week or so before the event, they totaled one of the cars, which was chassis number 63. So they scrambled, they took all the best parts, and they put all of it on chassis 56, and they showed up to Le Mans with 54 and 56. Now, those cars later on got numbers painted on the sides, which were number 46 and number 47. So they show up at Le Mans in 1951, 2 French drivers in the 46 car, 2 German drivers in the 47 car. They're ready to go. It's their first time competing in the 24 Hours of Le Mans, on the big stage, and they've got these 2 little amazing cars with little to no horsepower and great aerodynamics. In night practice, they crashed the number 47 car because they couldn't see the apexes and it was too dark. But they started the race with the number 46 car. The reason that Porsche was so successful in that first race was because of all the testing and development that they did. There were things built into the car that were kind of their secret weapons. They knew they weren't going to win on horsepower, but they knew they could win on redundancy and efficiency and all those other things. They knew if it rained, windshield wipers were crucial. So what did they do? They put an extra wiper above the windshield so that, if the lower ones failed, they can put the arm on and still see. Fuel system is an important part on a race car. These cars had a little mechanical pump on the engine. Well, if that fails, what do? The car's dead on track. So they put an electric fuel pump system that was auxiliary on the car. So if the mechanical one failed, they could flip the switch, have an electric fuel system to keep pumping fuel. The ignition system, that's another critical component. So they put an auxiliary ignition system on the car, extra coil in the back, extra wires, all these things. And so Porsche was really prepared. The Le Mans track is a huge track, and if you have a problem, back in the day, you had to fix it yourself and, get back to the pits. That little car, number 46 in 1951, just kept circling the track and circling the track. It might not have been the fastest one, but it was the most efficient. It needed less fuel stops. It was nice and smooth through the air, and they had everything they needed to be able to keep burning laps. And out of nearly 70 cars, Porsche finished 20th overall. They not only beat all of the 1100cc cars, but they also beat all the 1500cc cars. So I would say for their first international race, first time showing up on the motorsport stage to finish 20th overall and win in class, it was a huge success. So in the beginning at Le Mans 1951, here's this little car that was the giant killer. I look at that moment in time as the beginning of Porsche Motorsport.
Cam Ingram of Road Scholars continues the story of Porsche's frenzied motorsport development program, starting with the company's first purpose-built race car, the 550 Spider.
Hello, I'm Cam Ingram. I own Road Scholars. We're a Porsche restoration company that specializes in rare Porsches. We manage car collections, and we are part of the PCA Hurricane region here in Durham, North Carolina. Well, what's interesting about Porsche is that while they're winning with the Gmünd SL at Le Mans, they're already working on their first purpose-built clean sheet race car, which ultimately is the 1500 RS Spider. When you refer to as a clean sheet race program, the Gmünd SL or even the America Roadster were based on production 356s. So the 550 or 1500 RS Spider is really Porsche's first time of taking a clean sheet engineering paper in building from scratch a purpose-built race car. The 550, it is the beginning of the genetic strain of all Porsche motorsports. What's fascinating about the topic today is literally a transition from 1956 to 1967 and how quickly Porsche transitions from a coach-built era of aluminum handcraft-made competition cars into an aerospace era of fiberglass cars, as we know, the Piëch generation, the revolution of Piëch and lightweight. But what we're really talking about is utilizing lightweight and effective horsepower and the combination of both in an endurance package. As we know, Porsches don't quit, they don't die. And we see that immediately with the success of the 550 program in Europe, and particularly in the United States. When you have all these amazing Spider pilots, Ken Miles, Jack McAfee, and that was our first introduction. Beyond James Dean, we are seeing all these SCCA championships being won by these new cars from Germany with this mid-engine platform, with the lightweight body, 1,300 pounds at that time, and of course, the Ernst Furman 4-cam engine. So the whole package together was all about efficiency, lightweight, and effectiveness for endurance. To the untrained eye or layperson, a 550 and 550A is hard to distinguish aesthetically. They look very similar from 54 to 56. The 550A is a serious evolution of the 550. So it has a space frame chassis with this aluminum body, and the whole thing is about 300 pounds lighter than the 550, making it so much more effective as a track weapon. To simplify the evolution of the chassis frames from a ladder frame into a tube space frame, you're talking about rigidity as well as flex. When you drive a 550, you're so aware of how small it is and how connected to the road you are. When you become comfortable with the platform, you can really start to steer with the throttle around corners. And that was the beauty of the model, and the way that the chassis would flex. You can predict how to throttle steer the car over long corners that have a decreasing radius. So they're just a blast. They're a real pleasure to drive. Completely different experience to drive a 550A. It is such a more refined driving experience. It's not as raw as a 550 in the sense that you can point and shoot. It feels like a modern GT4 race car, if you will, as compared to a 550, to make that analogy. So Porsche develops the 550A, and they go immediately to Nürburgring, which was such an important race for Porsche, being their home track and home country, and they win class right out of the box with the 550A model. 11 weeks later, two mechanics, they take the new 550A model to the Targa Florio, and this is Porsche's first time there. And believe it or not, he drives all 7.5 hours by himself and wins the overall race. Those two back-to-back victories had announced Porsche's presence going for overall wins with the new 550A model. It's a collaboration with Carlo Abarth, who's this Austrian-Italian gentleman that Porsche knows very well, Dr. Porsche knows well, and he's done so many great projects with Zagato, Fiat, and Alfa Romeo, heavily involved in the racing community and modifying the Italian marques to be more effective on the track. So Dr. Porsche, and Porsche in general, is immensely engrossed into the Formula program in 1959, and they realized that there's so much competition in the GT classes for the 1.5 and 1.6 liter displacement cars that they have to evolve their GT program based on 59 356A GTs and 356B GTs. So Dr. Porsche comes up with this idea to approach Carlo Abarth about building something that's not a cheater car. It fits right perfectly into the rule guide, but they take a base 356B GT and they modify it into one of the most special, especially built cars that Porsche ever produced. And what this quantifies as, it's a 356B GT that's built by two different firms. Veranzo Filipponi builds the first set of cars, and then Roccomoto builds a second group of cars. And it's one of the most distinct cars because it's the perfect German platform, engineering race platform, combined with Italian styling. So it's the best of both worlds. One of the defining characteristics of when you drive a Carrera Abarth GTL is they came up with one of the most iconic engines, the 692 3A engine, and that produced about 165 horsepower. It's a plain bearing engine, and it's a piece of artwork. But they were clocking these cars doing about 160 miles an hour at Le Mans, and then subsequently they also put in final production the 2-liter engine. And what this really accounts for is that it is a rocket ship of a 356 production car, because it has this bespoke Italian-built body that's 100 pounds lighter than a Carrera GT race car, and ultimately 500 pounds lighter than just a production car. So the sensation of torque and speed and response in a Carrera Abarth GTL is so different than the other production GT cars, and particularly the normal production cars. It's light years in responsiveness. They raced over 400 races, 100 class victories, and 46 overall victories, including 3 class victories in a row at Le Mans 3 years in a row. So that shows you right away how potent the Carrera Abarth GTL was. And that's what kept the Porsche torch lit. So the RSK is an evolution from the 550A. It's a smaller, more aerodynamic body, but also lighter frame. And the K comes from the design stamp of the front suspension components that has a K look to it in the front frame. And it was the car that won the Targa Florio for the second time in 1959. So now Porsche has won with the 550A in 1956, and now in 1959 with the evolved works car with the wishbone suspension. The RSK wins the Targa for the second time, and then the following year, 1960, with its brand new product, the RS60, it wins for the third time the Targa Florio overall, these 3 overall wins. And again, this solidifies Porsche as not just a world player in FI racing, GT racing, but it has now, the Italians have coined the phrase, the giant killer. There is so much happening in Porsche in 1959 through 1965. What's fascinating about Porsche in this era is that they're catering to so many aspects of motorsports, because they're still strongly dedicated to the privateer customer that can race all over the world in a GT car, and they're still building 356 GTs. The ultimate expression of that is the Carrera Abarth GTL. They're ending the evolution of the Spider production with RS60 and 61. So they're going through all this evolution as a motorsports company now. It's an end of an era in a sense, because they're finishing the coach-built aluminum cars, and now they're segueing into bigger production homologation cars for aerospace to meet the new era of racing, the 904 Carrera GTS. The 904 Carrera GTS is such an evolutionary car, but it's also a transition period for Porsche. For Ferdinand Piëch to design the car, for them to stem the tide of the competition in the 2-liter category, they ensured that they would win that class for the next 2 years with the 904. It's widely recognized that the 904 Carrera GTS is one of the most beautiful race cars, if road-going cars, that Porsche ever built. It's the beginning of a new era with aerospace technology using composites to build the body. And again, Porsche is looking for more consistency and building a race car and meeting homologation regulations, building 100 of these. Easier to do with a composite body. So Porsche can now control, to some degree, the predictability of how stable and stiff these cars are going to be. And they ultimately go with the final evolution of the 587.3 motor, which is the ultimate expression of the 4-cam engine, producing almost 200 horsepower. When you drive a 904, you're not really aware that it's a race car because it just handles so predictably. It's a delight to drive. That's why you see so many Carrera 904 GTSs doing tours, but it's also a very effective track weapon. These are all purpose-built race cars, but they're all street legal. And that's why the values of these cars transcend markets in today's world, because it checks so many boxes. You can buy any number of these cars we've mentioned and go to Cars and Coffee You can go do the Colorado Grand. You can go vintage racing at Rimsport or Monterey Historics, HSR. That's such a special thing, and it opens a lifestyle and life experience boxes that you can't really click with other cars. The 904 Carrera GTS was originally designed to have the 911 power plant in it. And because of production issues with the 911 and the popularity of the 911, that's why they used the final evolution of the 4-cam engines. They ultimately built one special car, the last 904 made, for Tour de France, wanting to go and win that ultimate endurance race. Porsche built this last expression of a 904 with a 6-cylinder and ultimately won that race. But then comes this 28-year-old designer that's so talented, married into the family, Ferdinand Piëch, who starts the whole evolution of lightweight, weapons-grade, aerospace technology, really transforming the project from the 904 into his first project, the 906. I think today when we think about Ferdinand Piëch, he must have been just such a disruptor. He was an industry disruptor, that's like a term in today's language, or an entrepreneur, but can you imagine this 28-year-old guy coming into this department and saying, we're making drastic changes. We're going to go back to a tubular space frame, and we're just going to push the envelope. And of course, he's thrown a few curveballs because they have all these leftover parts from the 904 Carrera GTS project. So they have to use the 5-bolt wheels. They have to use basically the suspension components because Porsche had planned for another 100 more cars of the 904 model. And so they have all these leftover parts that now they have to utilize. And being so Porsche, how do we create a evolutionary model, that Carrera 6, 906, and how do we utilize all the stuff we have left? Because they're not going to waste it. They're not going to waste these Carrera parts that were made, the suspension components and brake parts and wheels that they've spent a small fortune on for the 904. So in a very brilliant way, they packaged what they had to do with that suspension and all those parts for the 904, and they put it into this completely new thing. And it's just through his genius, Ferdinand Piëch, as his first project. The Porsche Carrera 906 was the next evolutionary step in the fiberglass generation cars from the 904 Carrera GTS. And people often refer to it as the Ferdinand Piëch revolution. Taking again a space frame tube chassis and combining it with a fiberglass body, but now a much more predictable. They had issues with the 904 because not every car was as rigid. They could not do a consistent rigid cars in terms of the tests. But now the 906, they can completely dial in how rigid the cars are and how they perform. And they combine it with the new engine, the new competition engine, the 901/20, which was the carburetor Weber motor, and of course the 901/21, which is the Bosch fuel-injected motor, combined into this chassis, which made it a very effective weapon, reigning supreme in the 2-liter class, and again, surprising people with overall wins with a model that was just supposed to be competitive in the 2-liter class. Well, Ferdinand Piëch was a tactician, and he was obsessed with weight saving. One of the defining features of a 906 is literally that oil return from the oil reservoir to the engine, and that's run through one of the chassis tubes. You can hear the oil going through the tube underneath your seat. It's so cool. Driving a 906 is like one of the most special experiences you can have. It is quintessentially prototype, and it feels very special. You're sitting on the ground. It is like a knife edge in handling. Of course, these iconic fenders that are a hindrance and awesome to look at because it disrupts your visibility on the track. But it's so neat to see those large fenders in front of you. And again, the 906 is Ferdinand Piëch's revolutionary approach, and draconian, you can say, but it's ultimately his first expression, which ends in 910, 907, 908, and ultimately the 917. So the 910, it's an evolutionary step for Ferdinand Piëch because now he's made a model that's competitive in hill climbs and endurance racing. He realizes they're pushing the envelope of lightweight so much, it wreaks havoc on them. They start producing one car for a race and then they sell to a customer. There's no coincidence that Porsche races as a factory works effort, only one season with the 910 in 1967, and they lose the championship by 1 point to Ferrari. But they lock up the 2-liter championship. They've already proven that they're winning overall races with all this model development starting at 550A all the way up to 910. Ferdinand Piëch and his team are already working on the next model, the 907. That's why we have such a short shelf life of the 910 from a works perspective, because they're already aware that they want something more. So they're going to combine what they already have executed with the formula of lightweight race cars and now combine it with bigger displacement motors and make it a more effective overall car that can compete for those overall wins. I've had the honor of driving a number of 904s, 906, and 910s, and the 910 is the perfectly balanced car because of the 13-inch wheels. That car handles so well. It's an evolutionary step in handling over the 906. The smaller wheels means the fenders are lower, so your greenhouse view outside the cockpit is amazing, and it's such a well-balanced car. I always say the 910 is the prototype you want to buy if you're going to use it for cars and coffee or go historic racing, and you don't need a team of people to work on it. And it's, in effect, the last prototype car that Porsche makes where you don't need a team. You can dial them in. They're robust cars, and they're just a delight to drive. I think you can certainly say that the 904, 906, and 910 model, they're a part of the same evolutionary family that gets to the 907, 908, and 917. Those are more closely related in some ways. But the 910, its ultimate expression was, of course, its famous win at Nürburgring in front of the home country and the home crowd, where Porsche put several team cars in the race. Each car had a U.S. driver and German driver. Joe Bezzetta, a smaller guy, paired with Udo Schutz, who's a big guy. They win, and the car is fitted for Udo, and Joe Bezzetta is driving the car, racing the car, and he having a hard time reaching the pedals, comes over one of the hills at Nürburgring and literally comes out of his seat. And it's such a great story, and it shows what Porsche was willing to do to win in front of the home crowd. Over the years, I've had the honor, sadly before Vic Elford passed, I had the opportunity to spend a lot of time with him. And of course, we're so lucky to have Brian Redman and so many of the other drivers that raced from that era. It's funny when you hear those drivers in private conversation, they talk about the trepidation they had with the tube frame cars because their worst fear was to be an accident and those tubes would collapse. They all talk about how it was just part of life. They accepted the consequences and the risks because they loved it. These guys weren't making tremendous money racing cars. A lot of it was to make a living, but also the pure passion of wanting to go fast. And so the Porsche success story, again, also has the right drivers. And if you look from 550 era all the way up to 917, the drivers are just as fascinating as the cars and the evolution of the models themselves.
Legendary Porsche factory driver Brian Redman and Revs Institute founder Miles Collier bring us to the start of the golden years of the prototype era of Porsche race cars, which ultimately gave Porsche its long-desired overall win at the 24 Hours of Le Mans in 1970. We start with the 908 Longtail.
The background of the 908 Langheck is basically founded in the origins of the 908 itself. At that time, which would have been 1968, the regulations had just changed for International Endurance Championship competition, and the maximum sized engine that was permissible had been reduced from 5 liters down to 3. And on the strength of that, Porsche realized that since they were already running cars of 2.2 liters with the 771 907s, that there was an opportunity to build a bigger engine and essentially stuff it into the same envelope. And indeed, the assignment that was given to Porsche engineers was make only the absolutely necessary changes to the 907 to accommodate a 908 motor. And that's what they did. Then with Ferdinand Piëch's obsession with high speed and the opportunities for fewer pit stops, and also the idea that if you have a very streamlined high-speed car compared to the competition, that you can run down the chutes much faster than the competition, go easier through the corners, and everything would be generally superior. With that, the 908 Langheck was born, and it was designed for the 4 high-speed races on the championship circuit: Daytona, Spa, Monza, and Le Mans.
You know, of course, being relatively new to racing at that time, I didn't really think much about anything until I drove it. And the 908 Longtail actually wasn't very stable, you know, in these fast corners, especially at Spa and at Le Mans to some degree. And we know now that the aerodynamic on the Longtail 908 isn't really all that good. And the 917, the first ones, the first 25, they're all very similar. They were more or less a copy. As is well known, the handling of the original 917s was terrible. And the 908 Longtail, I set the fastest lap, I think, in this car at Spa-Francorchamps, the fastest, most dangerous track in the world at that time, in 1969. And just over a year later, I went back for a 2-litre championship race, driving a Chevron, which was a short little car like this, with a top speed of 160 against the Longtail 200. I went 3 seconds faster. And that's because of the cornering power. You know, that lack of downforce was really a problem in those cars. You know, I remember going to a lecture in Stuttgart about this, you know, where Herr Bott was telling everybody more and more why these were necessary. I don't think they made any difference. If anything, they made it worse. And of course, Le Mans, 1969, were going to ban the 917s and the Longtail 908s because movable aerodynamic device. And Herr Piëch says, if you ban one Porsche, there will be no Porsches in the race. They let them run. Surprising.
These are pretty small. They must have had some effect, because I can't imagine Porsche didn't run the math on these.
No.
Now, I have a real problem thinking that this did anything, because it doesn't have any angle of incidence.
No.
It doesn't do anything. I think it's just streamlined. So it just enabled these. And then, of course, in '69, when these cars were at Le Mans, and the ACO said, you know, no moving aerodynamic devices, Steinemann managed to convince them that the 917 was so dangerous that it had to have the movable aerodynamic flaps, but they would lock them up on the 908. So I don't know what kind of a testimony that was about the 917. I can see Steinemann standing there with some official. These things are death traps. We're going to die. You've got to let those things go. Do you want these people's deaths on your hands? Mais non, monsieur. So. The 908 Flunder is a variation on the first 908 open car, which is sometimes referred to as the 908 Coke bottle. And that came about because the Porsche men discovered that the 908 Kurzheck, the short tail coupes, were slower than the open Ferrari prototypes of the same displacement. They looked at it and came to the conclusion that the difference was really whether the car was open-topped or not, and that started them doing research on the aerodynamics of an open-topped car, because they had heretofore thought that under any circumstances a coupe would have better aerodynamic properties than an open car did. So that was the genesis of the Coke bottle car. Then further observing the good aerodynamic properties of some of the competition caused them to come up with a smoother body, a much flatter configuration that had, again, a better drag coefficient, and so the Flunder was born. But that was, again, right towards the end of the 908 era, and Porsche already had their sights set on the 917.
There were 10 factory drivers in 1969, 6 Germans, 3 English, Vic Elford, Richard Atwood and myself, and 1 Swiss, Joe Siffert. The German drivers were complaining all the time. They were saying, Siffert and Redman get the best car, because we were winning all the races. So, the Nürburgring, the 2 Flunders appeared. Well, Siffert crashed ours, so then Vic Elford crashed his for Porsche Salzburg, so now we don't have a Flunder, and Siffert and I had to take Porsche Salzburg's spare car, which we'd never seen before, and we won. So it stopped all the comments.
The modifications that were done to this car before the start of the Watkins Glen 6 hour in 1969 were pretty brutal, because the thought was that the car was overheating as a function of the body design, and it probably wasn't. It was probably overheating because the first engine that was changed had a problem. And it was something that they couldn't fix easily, so it wasn't something like a timing problem or something like that. It was whatever it was, it just wasn't a happy engine. I always thought that these were one of the prettiest of the Porsche race cars, you know. The 917 Piëch was really an experiment by Porsche based on their brand new for 69 917s. And as Brian said earlier, the 917s of 1969 looked very much like a 908 Langhack. In fact, there was this idea that they had a removable tail cone, so the car could either be made into a Kurzheck or a Langhack just by unsnapping the last 3 feet of the tail. Anyway, brilliantly conceived idea that it was absolutely diabolical in practice. Porsche, with courtesy of their 908s, won the World Manufacturers' Championship in 1969, and then set their sights on different game. And because the United States was one of the largest, probably in 1969, the largest export market for Porsche, they wanted to have a presence in a significant racing series over there. And what series was more significant than the Canadian-American Challenge Cup? So they prepared a special 917 and essentially put a 908 Flunder body on it, and fitted it with 65 gallons worth of fuel, sent it off to the US with ostensible sponsorship from Volkswagen of America, so it has a Porsche Audi emblazoned on the sides. It was a way to try and create more excitement about Porsche's American presence. We put the Piëch back to its original spec because we felt that that was the most representative appearance of the car. When we do a restoration here, we do restorations that are what I would call archaeologically accurate. I mean, we try and understand everything about the configuration of the car at the time that we want to do this. You know, the fascinating thing about the Piëch in its earliest configuration, I think, is the holdover of the 1969 standard sports car exhaust system. And this has cookie cutter megaphone here. There's two cookie cutter megaphones on the back, and then another one up front. So essentially what we have is every 3 cylinders gets a cookie cutter megaphone. Now to do that, the front 6 cylinders have to have a header system that is coiled up under the sides of the cars on both sides. That's why all of these vents are here, is because you've got all these damn headers up there. It's the most bizarre thing you've ever seen. I have no idea why Porsche did it, because it vanished without a trace in 1970. And the most interesting thing about them is that the car has a distinctively different sound from the conventional exhaust system. Sounds like 2 911 engines running. It's a funny thing. The other thing about this car, which I'm not sure I understand, was in the day, as we can see from those photographs up there, the car must have had some kind of a front-end grip or front-end turn-in problem, because every race that we see it gets bigger elephant ears on the front, it gets a chopped nose, they cut a great big hole in the front to exhaust the oil radiator out the top, they put slots in the top of the fenders, all of this to try and evidently to get some more front-end grip. The odd thing is, you've driven this car in this configuration and so on. It handles perfectly. It's a delightful driving car.
I think there were 2 of them, because about 1969, late on, perhaps November or something like that, there was a press meeting at Hockenheim.
That's right.
And I drove.
There was a development car, and then there was a car that they sent to the States.
Well, I drove it, and it was like snowing a bit, and we were giving journalists a ride.
In the snow. Oh, good.
Yeah, well, it was damp and flurries of snow.
The origins of the 908-3 was essentially stemmed from Porsche really getting the bit between their teeth at this point in trying to dominate the world manufacturers' championship. And in 1970 and 71, they produced another version of the 908 called the 908-3. This was based on their experience in 1968 and 69 that races such as the Targa Florio and the Nürburgring could be won by relatively underpowered cars if you could keep enough momentum going, if you could get the corner velocities high enough. Those tracks weren't horsepower tracks. They decided that they would build a special car just for the Targa Florio and the Nürburgring. And that was the 908-3. So it's a much, much lighter car than the other 908s. In fact, other teams, when they looked at the car, couldn't believe that the thing would stay together at those weights.
Oh, 1,100 pounds.
Yeah, 375 horsepower. And everything on it is honeycomb fiberglass and Kevlar and things of that nature. You can read a newspaper through the side sponson covers and things of that nature. The differential was moved to the tail end of the transmission. That allowed the motor to be moved forward and moved the driver forward, so that the deformable crash structure of a 908-3 was the driver's legs. You knew that there was something strange going on when you sit behind the wheel, and you realize that that black bar that's just under the hub of the steering wheel is the front anti-roll bar. But the cars were phenomenally good on twisty courses. Their power-to-weight ratio was excellent. They ended up winning 3 out of 4 races that they were designed for. Once in the Targa Florio, twice in the Nürburgring. Oh, and we should never forget that they went on in 1980, a 908-3 won an FIA World Championship makes race. Very few race cars are competitive 10 years after they were designed.
The project manager for Porsche, who never received any recognition at all, was Manfred Bantley. You never heard at all, but he was the project leader for the 908-3, and it was based on the hill climb car, but I don't know to what degree.
The 909.
Yeah. Just very, very light, 1,100 pounds. It's unbelievable, isn't it? And of course, as we all know, it burns fairly well, because in 1971, I'd retired at the end of 70, a stupid retirement to South Africa, come back, no drive. But in April of 71, I got a call from John Wyer. Derek Bell had taken my place in the Porsche team. Hello, Redman, he said, would you like to do the Targa Florio? Bell's never done it. And Sifford and I had won it the year before. And I thought, to me, this is a great opportunity, to get back into big time. So we do it, but the day before the race, Sifford crashed it pretty hard. Right. It was repaired overnight, and on the race day, John Wyer said to me, Redman, we'd like you to start the race. Well, Sifford always started. I said, what for, John? He said, I don't want Sifford and Rodriguez knocking each other off, because they were banging, I said. So I started, and just before the start, engineer Helmut Flegel says to me, Redman, if you must have the accident, do not crash on the right side, which is where the fuel tank was, where you're sitting. Well, of course, 22 miles into the 44-mile course, I turned for an easy corner, the steering broke, and I hit a stone kilometre post right in the fuel tank. It exploded. Goodness. I was very lucky to get out. There was nothing left. I saw Gerard Larousse, who was driving a 908-3 for Martini, about 10 years ago. And he says to me, Brian, when I see your accident on the Targa Florio, I am very worried, very worried. I said, I was pretty worried as well. He says, you know what was left from the car? I said, no. He says, nothing. He said, there was a hole in the road, and inside the hole was the crankshaft. So.
Having you drive this as many times as you have has always been a great source of pleasure for us. It was fun to see you in the thing.
I remember one year we did the pre-race weekend.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, yeah.
And I went out in it. Terrible handling. I mean, it was sliding everywhere. And I said to Scott, I came in, I said, how old are these tyres? And he just said, well, they're pretty old. And I said, well, can you put the new ones on? He said, well, we can't use them because they're slicks and you have to have treaded tyres. And this is the pre-race weekend. Right, so I said, just put them on, so. instantly like 5 seconds faster and perfectly all right. And really, when those slicks were grooved, because we had to have, treaded tyres for the race, there wasn't much difference in the handling. Handling was fine. So.
Well, occasionally we have a tendency to have pretty old tires on some of these cars. so it wakes the driver up. The significance of the 917K, I think, is that, as so many people say, if it's not the greatest enduro car ever built, it's certainly in the top 5. One only has to look at its competition record in the day. And indeed, we can think about the 1971 season by chronicling the races it didn't win rather than the races it did. I think it only didn't win twice. The car is a remarkable thing, and especially given its inauspicious start in life, where it had very, very flawed aerodynamics. But it came good, and after that really served as much of the basis for Porsche's subsequent development of the 936s and ultimately on to the 956s and 62s when you look at the long-tail aero of the 1971 917 against what those cars looked like. I don't think any other racing car in history single-handedly killed 2 racing series because it was so overwhelmingly superior. And I think that says everything about the car.
Taking on the 917 project and building 25 917s at the same time that they were racing 5 908s, and at the same time they're designing and building a 908-3 all at the same time. So how they did that, I don't know. I mean, the engineers must have been absolutely exhausted. And of course, the 917 eventually became a world-beating car. And today, everybody looks at the 917, the best car in the world and the great era. But when it came out, it was not.
Diabolical, as I understand it.
Towards the end of 1969, there was an agreement made between Porsche, which means Herr Piëch, and John Wyer, for John Wyer to run the factory team in 1970. And so a Porsche test at the Österreich-Ring in October of 1969, and they were really observing what was going on, and Kurt Ahrens was there, and he and I took it in turns to drive the 917 in its original form, but with modifications. We'd do 2 or 3 laps because there's no improvement. We did it all day. We're taking turns, we do 2 or 3 laps. No. At the end of the day, John Horseman, he pointed at the nose of the 917 and he said, "You see all these flies on the nose? There aren't anywhere else." And so they borrowed tools and equipment from the Porsche truck that was there, and they cut the tail off and made it into, I was first out the following morning, and it looked like a pickup. Instead of that long tail like that, it's like this, with plywood and balsa wood and God knows what, duct tape, of course. And I stayed out 7 laps. And I came in and I said, now we have a race car with 3 seconds faster. Unbelievable. I think actually the Porsche engineers knew what the problem was. The trouble is that Herr Piëch wouldn't let them change anything. If it would lose 1 kilometre an hour down the Mulsanne Straight, they couldn't do it. They weren't allowed to do it. And so it took John Wyer's team, really, to prove that. And of course, we turned up for Daytona for the first race of the new season. And there is a Porsche Salzburg entry, which is really a factory entry. It's Herr Piëch again, and John Wyer we knew nothing about it, but we managed to finish first and second, and I actually drove both cars, so I finished first and second. So, of course, when Porsche won Le Mans in 1970, I think Richard Atwood and Hans Hermann started something like 14th, and they'd chosen the 4.5 litre engine, which was the one that all the 917s had when they first came out. And they thought they didn't have a chance, and one by one, they all dropped out. Our team of 3 cars, we had David Hobbs and Mike Halewood in the 3rd car, Leo Kinnunen and Pedro Rodriguez in the other, and Siffert and myself. First thing that happens is the crankshaft breaks on the Rodriguez car, which they never did. And then Halewood, in the heavy rain, he hit the back of a parked car, a broken down car in the Dunlop curve. And when he got back to the pits, John and I said to him, "Halewood, don't call us, we'll call you."
Well, in fact, he had insisted on staying on dry tires or intermediates or something when it was suggested that he ought to be on reins.
Yes, I'm not sure of the
That
exact.
probably was not a good decision.
No. And for us, of course, leading by 4 laps, that's 32 miles, Jackie Ickx in the factory Ferrari catches up to Siffert. Now they're racing like it's a 10-lap race. And Ickx actually went off the track and a corner worker was killed. And just after that, Siffert comes through the chicane and there are 3 slower cars ahead, all having their own battle. And he swerves off to the right and right in front of the Porsche pit. Woo! Oh, the engine go. The 917 engine would go to 8,400 for 40 hours. If it went once to 8.6, it broke, and it went to a lot more than 8.6.
Well, that was the magic of Le Mans, is that it wasn't the fastest car that won in those days. No. I bought this car from Wojciech Pollak.
Really?
I don't know if you probably were in his back parts warehouse where he had those racks of 917s in Carroll's, 3 stories high. This came from there, and I remember when I bought it from him, and I wanted the thing the way it was, and I said, "Oh, Mr. Pollak, I would really like it if you just leave it alone. We think it's really quite spectacular in that." And he finally begrudgingly said, "Yeah, okay." So one of the things that I love about this car, because it's unrestored, is the beauty of things like the door gap. But of course, the car, when it was built new, would have been better than that. This car has had 2 seasons of racing on it by the time it got here, and things move around. Fiberglass changes a little bit. It's really a wonderful thing to have a car that has all of its history still in it. You can read all the marks and the dings and the damage that's been done to it, and every one of those has a story. This literally is the way that these cars looked when they were running. It crashed at Daytona, and in my book I show a picture of the right-hand side of the car. It's up against the wall at the top of the banking where it hit. And there's a big chunk out of the right front fender right above the wheel, right here on that side. And that was fixed so hastily with what looked like pure fiberglass resin with no glass in it that no paint has been able to stick to it. So the history of that crash is still impounded, and even the shape of the brake that's been patched in it. And that's the beauty of an unrestored car, is that you can read them. They'll tell you something. Like all the paint that's off the join on the engine and the cab back there, and that linear, right where the red stripe is. Well, that's, as you know better than I, that's where the duct tape was put on every time before the car went out, I guess to smooth the airflow a little bit. And so, those are the wonderful things that you don't see on these cars that have been shined up to look like Rolls Royces. And they never were. They had to look good at 50 yards going 180 miles an hour. That was just fine.
In the end, Porsche didn't just achieve its goal to win overall at Le Mans in 1970. The red with white stripes Porsche Salzburg 917K crossed the line in first place after 24 hours of racing, with Richard Atwood and Han Turman at the wheel. But the next 2 podium finishers also were Porsches, models which reflected the previous years of constant development. The Martini Racing 917 LH, or Longtail, finished second with Gerard Larousse and Willie Cowson driving. And in third, Helmut Marko, yes, the same one advising today's Red Bull Formula One team, and Rudy Linz placed third in a Martini Racing Porsche 908-2 LH Flunderspider. If there was any doubt of Porsche's status in endurance racing in 1969, 1970 cemented the manufacturer as a true giant of the sport. 53 years, 19 overall wins later, no manufacturer even comes close.